If you are not using it, may I take it? That was all Willa Thornaby asked. In the spring of 1879, the 18-year-old walked through Bitterroot Bend, Wyoming territory, pulling an old handcart behind her, its wooden wheels groaning beneath a strange load. Bent lengths of galvanized iron pipe, dented sections of tin-lined tubing, broken pieces once salvaged from an abandoned mining flume. Every bump sent them clattering together like a box of bones. Into the town, every piece looked like a joke. Quiet murmurs drifted from shaded porches. Not cruel, just certain. Folks decided her family had finally become desperate enough to collect scrap instead of saving their farm. Gideon Rusk, the valley's veteran ditch builder, gave a low chuckle. Girls hauling leaks now, Willa heard him. She did not turn around. Her skirt was gray with dust. Her hands were rough from work. Her face gave nothing away. By sundown, half the town had seen her collecting what they had thrown aside. Not one of them knew she was gathering the bones of a harvest. Bitterroot Bend was a small frontier settlement pressed against the edge of Wyoming territory, where shallow creek beds, dry gravel benches, and relentless wind decided whether families stayed or left. Winter had barely loosened its grip, yet cracks already spread across the fields. Old-timers swore that May carried the breath of July that year. A narrow creek and a handful of rain hollows supplied nearly every farm. When storms finally came, they came too late, then vanished too fast. Open ditches drank as much water as the crops did. By the time the flow reached the last rows, much of it had already soaked away or disappeared into the hot, restless air. 2 summers earlier, Willa's mother had died after a long winter illness that slowly emptied the little farmhouse of its warmth. She left behind no fortune, only a faded apron, a weathered seed ledger, and carefully labeled cloth bags filled with dent corn, pole beans, squash, and dry beans. Every spring planting had once begun with those pages spread across the kitchen table. Willa's father, Silas Thornaby, had once been one of the finest ditch builders in the valley. He could judge the fall of the land with little more than a glance and build a wooden flume that carried water exactly where it belonged. Then, a wagon loaded with quarry stone overturned on a steep trail, badly crushing one of his legs. His knowledge survived, his strength did not. The work that had once belonged to 2 parents quietly settled onto Willa's shoulders. She learned to mend barrels, splice rope, patch old tools, and plant every seed by hand. More than anything, she learned to recognize the expression on her father's face whenever pain reached him before he admitted it. One evening, she opened her mother's seed ledger. The last page ended halfway through a planting season. Without saying a word, Willa understood that the next lines would have to be written by her own hand. The Thornaby fields rested on ground about 11 feet higher than the creek below. Water could reach the lower rows, but it lost its strength climbing the slope. Carrying buckets was painfully slow. Digging a new ditch demanded muscles Silas no longer had. Hiring help was simply beyond the family's reach. After every brief rain, Willa walked the property instead of rushing back inside. She watched where water lingered, where it disappeared, and where the soil stayed dark the longest. North of the fields, a gravel bench held a shallow rain hollow that remained full for days after every storm. It stood nearly 7 feet above the highest rows. Most people saw nothing more than a muddy depression. Willa saw stored elevation. For the first time, she realized the farm did not truly lack water. It lacked a way to persuade water to travel where it mattered most. Standing between the quiet rain hollow and the thirsty fields below, she began to see a path no one else had noticed. But her father only knew how to move water by force. To guide it gently down the slope, Willa needed a different kind of wisdom, and she knew exactly who to ask. That evening, she walked toward the small cabin beyond the eastern pasture, where her widowed grandmother, Mara Voss, lived alone. Before following her family north, she had lived beside old mission ditches where every drop of water was guided with patience instead of force. Tucked inside a cedar chest was a weathered notebook filled with careful sketches and short observations. Its pages spoke of slope, seepage, clay seals, willow filters, and the quiet habit of water to obey the land, long before it obeyed people. She never handed Willa a finished answer. Instead, the old woman turned a few yellowed pages and rested one finger beside a single sentence. Fast water feeds the ditch, slow water feeds the root. That was all. Willa studied every drawing. She learned how to set stakes, stretch a line, read a simple water level, and let gravity do work that tired hands no longer could. The ideas were old, older than the settlement itself, yet they still waited for someone willing to trust them. One evening, Willa walked across the pasture to the cabin and laid her mother's seed ledger beside Mara's worn water notebook. Without another word, 2 generations of quiet wisdom seemed to meet across the table, waiting for a third pair of hands to carry them into the field. As word spread through Bitterroot Bend, Willa began asking every family for old irrigation pipe they no longer wanted. Most pointed toward rusting piles behind barns, without asking a single question. Gideon Rusk, the valley's veteran ditch builder, watched her load another bent section onto the handcart and laughed under his breath. "Water needs a deep ditch," he said, not a girl carrying a pocketful of leeks. The remark traveled farther than Willa did. Elias Brackett, the settlement's ditch inspector and water clerk, heard the same story and dismissed it just as quickly. "Scrap pipe patched together by an 18-year-old, he said, would never count as dependable irrigation. The hardest words came from family. Tobin Thornaby, Silas's nephew, farmed the neighboring property and often crossed the fence after finishing his own chores. That evening, he looked from the dry fields to Silas's injured leg before speaking. "This isn't about being wrong," he said quietly. "I'm afraid you're giving him something else to believe in, and I don't know if he can survive losing it again." Silas said nothing. Neither did Willa. She lifted another rusted pipe onto the cart, thanked the farmer who had given it away, and continued down the dusty road. That night, Willa opened her mother's seed ledger and began drawing lines no one else had seen. Not a ditch, not a pump, not water thrown into the hot air. Her plan was smaller, quieter, and harder to notice. She called it a gravity head root watering line. At the top sat the rain hollow on the gravel bench. When storm water gathered there, it would pass through a willow screen to catch leaves, grit, and broken grass. From there, it would settle inside half of an old whiskey barrel that held about 38 gallons. Willa marked 3 layers inside it: gravel at the bottom, sand above that, and charcoal packed loosely near the outlet. Mud would fall before the water entered the pipe. From the barrel, the flow would move into a main line nearly 2 inches wide, built from the best salvaged lengths. That line would run 180 yards along a gentle fall. Silas had once taught her to read. It would not rush. It would not roar. It only had to keep moving. Near the crop rows, smaller branch lines, each about 3/4 of an inch wide, would carry water to the roots. Willa planned to punch tiny holes, with an awl or a heated nail, spacing them every 18 inches. The holes would sit beside dent corn, pole beans, squash, and dry beans. Clay plugs would slow the stronger openings. Wooden pegs would close the weak ones until pressure balanced. The whole line would rest in shallow trenches, 6 to 8 inches deep, then disappear beneath straw. The straw would shield the damp soil from sun and wind. The water would not shine on the surface for people to admire. It would work where crops actually lived. Silas leaned over the kitchen table, one hand resting heavily on his cane. He studied the route from the hollow to the rows, then touched one finger to the long descending line. "You measured the fall," he said. Willa did not smile. She only turned the page and began calculating how much old pipe she still needed. The following weeks became a quiet hunt for things everyone else had forgotten. Willa searched abandoned sheds for straight lengths of galvanized iron pipe. She pulled dented sections of tin-lined tubing from collapsed irrigation ditches. Behind an abandoned mining flume, she found cracked wooden troughs that still held useful hardware beneath years of dust. Every piece looked worthless alone. Together, they began to resemble a system. She gathered strips of rawhide, cakes of beeswax, hardened pine resin, buckets of sticky clay, and bundles of fresh willow stakes cut along the creek. Even a broken whiskey barrel had value once its sound half was separated from the rotten boards. Orrin Pike, the town blacksmith, watched her spread the pieces across his shop floor. He asked no questions. He widened a few crushed pipe ends, forged several iron bands to hold weak joints together, and handed them back without offering advice she had not requested. The design remained hers. The laughter did not disappear. People slowed their wagons to watch her load another crooked pipe or another cracked fitting. Some shook their heads. Others smiled as if humoring a determined young woman who had mistaken junk for opportunity. Silas worked beside her whenever his injured leg allowed. He held one end of a pipe while she measured the next. He tied bundles of willow stakes with steady hands and spoke only when a shorter route or stronger joint came to mind. One afternoon, Willa carried a small silver hairpin that had belonged to her mother into the trading post. She exchanged it for a heavy brass fitting to connect the settling barrel to the main line, the one crucial piece she couldn't salvage from the dirt. She never mentioned the trade. Not until Mara, visiting the farmhouse one afternoon, noticed the empty place inside the small cedar box where her daughter's hairpin had rested for years. The old woman closed the lid without a word. She understood that some things were not being discarded. They were simply becoming something else. The next morning, Willa carried a shovel to the rain hollow before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She marked the route with willow stakes driven into the ground, one careful step at a time. Then she began digging. The trench was never meant to be deep. 6 to 8 inches was enough. The pipe did not need to hide from winter frost. It only needed protection from the wind, the sun, and careless boots. Silas refused to remain inside the house. After only a few minutes, pain forced him to stop digging. Instead, he settled onto an old wooden crate beside the trench. Across his knees rested 2 straight poles joined by a clear water tube. The homemade water level rose and fell with every adjustment. Willa shifted the stakes. Silas watched the line. Another inch. She lifted one end. Hold it there. The water settled. That's the fall. Together they worked without wasting words. One by one, the salvaged sections of main pipe disappeared into the shallow trench. Every joint was cleaned, wrapped with damp rawhide, sealed with melted beeswax mixed with pine resin and rendered tallow, then tightened beneath iron bands Orrin Pike had forged. Near the rain hollow, Willa assembled the settling barrel. A woven willow screen covered the opening to catch leaves and grass. Beneath it lay a layer of coarse gravel, then clean sand, then crushed charcoal. A narrow outlet sat several inches above the muddy bottom, allowing heavy sediment to settle before clear water entered the main line. The branch pipes took even longer. Using a heated nail and a small awl, Willa burned tiny openings into each section, measuring roughly 18 inches between every hole. She tested every outlet with a cup of water. If one stream flowed too quickly, she shaped a small clay plug to slow it. If another barely trickled, she widened it by the width of a needle. Nothing happened quickly. Everything demanded another adjustment. Tobin, having walked over from his own fields, stood nearby with folded arms, watching the narrow pipes disappear beneath the soil. "You're building something too small to fight a summer," he said quietly. Willa kept working. A warm gust swept dust across the field, carrying away loose straw before she gathered it again. Silas tightened his grip on the water level until his knuckles turned pale. Pain spread across his face, but he never loosened the line. Holding that simple instrument steady was the only way he could still help his daughter hold the farm together. The first real test came after a brief spring rain. Water gathered in the rain hollow exactly as Willa had hoped. It slipped through the willow screen, settled inside the barrel, and entered the main line without a sound. She stood beside the first row of dent corn with Silas, Mara, and Tobin. They waited. Nothing. Willa followed the buried pipe uphill, scraping away loose soil with her hands. Less than 40 yards from the barrel, she found the first leak, then another, then a third. The afternoon sun had tightened the rawhide until gaps appeared around the joints. One seal of beeswax and pine resin had softened in the heat. Instead of reaching the crops, the water disappeared into the ground long before it reached the field. The system had obeyed gravity. It had simply escaped too soon. News traveled quickly through Bitterroot Bend. When Gideon Rusk heard what had happened, he shrugged. "An open ditch may waste water," he said, "but at least a man can see where it's going." Willa knelt beside the patch of wet soil, pressed one hand into the mud, and stared at the place where her water had stopped. For the first time, she understood that a sound idea could still fail because of one careless joint. Willa never answered Gideon's remark. The next morning, she pulled every leaking joint apart and started again. She warmed fresh beeswax over a small fire, mixed it with thicker pine resin, then wrapped each connection with rawhide while it was still damp. Before the leather could shrink, she secured every joint with the iron clamps Orrin Pike had forged. Silas watched her work for a while before reaching into an old toolbox. Without a word, he handed her the sealing knife he had once carried while repairing wooden flumes. She accepted it with both hands. Mara looked at the rebuilt joints and spoke softly. "Water forgives slow hands. It never forgives an open path." That evening, Willa opened her mother's seed ledger. Instead of writing about seeds, she began recording failures. Seal failed. Under noon heat. Below it, she noted the hour, the remaining water inside the barrel, the location of every leak, and how far the flow had traveled before disappearing. The ledger was no longer becoming a record of crops. It was becoming a record of lessons. Every mistake now had a place. Every repair would have one too. The second test lasted much longer. This time, the repaired joints held. Water flowed through the main line, entered the branch pipes, and finally reached the first rows of corn. One by one, tiny openings released slow drops into the soil beside the roots. Willa crouched beside a young stalk and pressed her fingertips into the earth. The soil was dark, exactly where it needed to be. For a few quiet moments, everything seemed to work. Then the trickle slowed. Another hour passed. Several outlets stopped altogether. Willa opened one of the branch lines and found the problem. Fine silt from the rain hollow had slipped through the barrel and collected inside the tiny openings until the water could no longer pass. The system had learned to carry water. It had not yet learned to protect it. Elias Brackett arrived before sunset with his small notebook tucked beneath one arm. He examined one blocked outlet, wrote several brief lines, then closed the cover. "A watering system that loses itself to a little mud," he said, "cannot be trusted through an entire season." Silas looked at the damp rings around the first few corn plants. The idea had worked, just not for long enough. Beside him, Tobin said nothing. For the first time, he had seen proof that Willa had almost been right. That evening, Willa returned to Mara's water notebook. She found a page marked with only 6 words. "Let the mud fall before the water." The next morning, the settling barrel came apart. Instead of one chamber, Willa built 2. The first held the heavy sediment. The second carried cleaner water through layers of coarse gravel, clean sand, crushed charcoal, and a tightly woven willow basket. She shaped a raised clay lip between the chambers, so only the clearer water could spill into the outlet while the heavier mud remained behind. The branch lines changed as well. Several openings were widened by the width of a nail. Others received carefully shaped clay plugs until every row released nearly the same steady trickle. It was slow work, patient work, work measured one hole at a time. Gideon Rusk still smiled whenever he passed the field, but he no longer walked away immediately. Orrin Pike stayed longer each afternoon, watching the rebuilt system without interrupting. Silas recognized something familiar. His daughter was no longer experimenting. She was working like a craftsman. The third trial began with quiet confidence. Water moved steadily through every branch line. Damp circles formed beneath the straw, exactly where Willa had planned. She pressed one finger 3 inches into the soil beside a cornstalk. Cool. Moist. She recorded the result in her mother's ledger. Silas watched the rows for a long moment. "How far can you carry it?" he asked softly. It sounded less like a question than the beginning of belief. By noon, the prairie answered. Hot winds swept across the fields. Heat climbed out of the ground. One stretch of pipe lay too flat, slowing the flow before it reached the last rows. A ground squirrel uncovered a branch line while digging. Several bean leaves curled before the noon bell echoed across the valley. The system had survived the morning. It had not conquered the day. Willa looked toward the drying rows and quietly marked another note in the ledger before her father could see disappointment cross her face. From that day forward, Willa stopped defending her idea. She measured it. Every evening she opened the seed ledger and filled another page. Buckets poured into the settling barrel, minutes before water reached each row, moisture 3 inches below the surface. The hour when bean leaves first began to curl, plant height every 5th day, blocked outlets, leaking joints, pipe sections that needed to rise another ½ inch. The field became her workshop. A line of stakes marked the correct fall. Stones lifted sagging sections of pipe. Fresh straw covered bare soil. Exposed branch lines disappeared beneath another layer of earth, where ground squirrels could no longer find them. The notebook grew thicker with facts instead of hopes. Silas read every entry without changing a single word. Outside the farm, Gideon still believed in open ditches. Brackett still trusted official records more than homemade systems. Inside the field, numbers quietly replaced arguments. Late one afternoon, Willa heard another shovel strike the ground. She looked up. Tobin had crossed the fence line and stepped into the trench beside her. Without apology, without explanation, he began digging a new branch line exactly where she had marked it. Nothing else needed to be said. Then the sky stopped giving. One day passed without rain, then another, then another. By the end of the 3rd week, Bitterroot Bend had gone 23 days without a meaningful storm. Afternoon winds reached 41 miles an hour, sweeping dust across the valley like smoke. By noon, the temperature climbed to 103 degrees. The land made its judgment quickly. Open ditches shrank before the water reached the final rows. Corn leaves rolled into tight green tubes before midday. Squash vines collapsed across the soil. Pole beans dropped blossoms they could no longer afford to keep. Even the cattle stood motionless beneath narrow strips of shade, unwilling to waste strength. Willa's field looked strangely ordinary. There were no sparkling channels, no rushing water, no muddy trenches, only small dark circles hidden beneath straw where slow drops disappeared into the earth beside the roots. The flow seemed almost too quiet to matter. Impatient eyes would have called it useless. But each afternoon, Willa walked the rows with her ledger tucked beneath one arm. She waited for the bean leaves to curl. The first day, they folded later than the neighboring fields. The second day, later still. By the 5th, they stayed open, long after the noon bell. Then, something changed. One afternoon, they did not curl at all. Silas stood at the edge of the field without speaking. Tobin quietly repaired another section of straw mulch before the wind could carry it away. Across the valley, Gideon, Brackett, and the neighboring farmers watched their own fields surrender one row at a time. Nature offered no praise. It never does. It simply spared the plants whose roots still found water. Near sunset, Willa knelt beside a row of beans and touched the cool soil beneath the straw. The leaves above her hand remained wide open. For the first time in weeks, she lowered herself onto the ground, not because she was exhausted, but because her heart had not yet caught up with what her eyes were finally seeing. The dry spell finally loosened its grip, but the memory of it remained in every field. One evening, Silas walked the rows with the help of his cane. His steps were slow, each one measured against the ache in his leg. He stopped beside a stand of corn and knelt with visible effort. Pulling back the straw, he pressed his fingers 3 inches into the soil. It was still cool, still damp, exactly as Willa's ledger said it should be. He lifted his eyes toward the neighboring farm. Gray soil stretched beneath curled stalks that had surrendered days earlier. Then he turned back to his daughter's field, where her mother's seeds still stood green against the summer. Silas never said he had been wrong. He never said he was proud. Instead, He looked across the property toward a neglected patch of ground beyond the fence. How far can you carry it east? Willa followed his gaze. The east field had been abandoned since his accident. Only then did she understand. Her father was no longer looking at the system as an experiment. He was looking at it as the future of their farm. By the following week, people had stopped talking about Willa's cart full of scrap pipe. They had started talking about her field. Gideon Rusk came early one morning, not because he believed the stories, but because he refused to believe them. He walked the length of the buried line without speaking. He examined the settling barrel, the willow screen, the shallow trenches hidden beneath straw, and the branch pipes disappearing quietly into the rows. He searched for the trick. There wasn't one. At the first row of corn, Gideon lowered himself onto one knee and brushed the straw aside. His weathered fingers pressed into the soil. Not muddy, not dry, just cool enough to hold life. He remained there longer than anyone expected. Then he looked across the fence toward his own open ditch. The channel still carried water, but the ground beside the last rows had already hardened into a pale crust. Water had traveled farther across the surface than it ever had beneath it. The laughter that had followed Willa through town vanished without ceremony. One by one, several neighboring farmers stepped closer to the field, saying nothing. Gideon slowly stood, dusted the earth from his hands, and looked at Willa for a long moment. The dust fell away. The truth did not. "How did you keep it from choking?" he asked quietly. It was the first question he had asked that carried no trace of ridicule, and Willa answered by walking him back toward the settling barrel instead of saying, "I told you so." By late summer, there was little left to argue about. Elias Brackett arrived, carrying a measuring staff beneath one arm and the settlement's water ledger beneath the other. He walked the route from the rain hollow to the first row, stopping often to measure the fall of the land, the length of the main line, and the height of the settling barrel above the fields. He asked simple questions. How many buckets filled the barrel after a storm? How many minutes before water reached the last row? How many crop rows did the system serve? Willa answered none of them from memory. She opened her mother's seed ledger. Every figure was already there. Dates, times, water levels, pipe adjustments, blocked outlets, plant growth. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing needed to be. Brackett compared the entries with what stood before him, then closed both books without another challenge. When harvest arrived, Bitterroot Bend gathered almost without planning to. The dent corn filled its ears more completely than neighboring fields. Pole beans still hung heavy on healthy vines. Squash rested broad and firm beneath fading leaves. Dry beans filled enough sacks to feed the family through winter, and still leave seed for the following spring. It was not a miraculous harvest. It was something quieter. It was a harvest that should not have survived that summer. Brackett opened the settlement ledger one last time and wrote a new entry. Working gravity head root watering line, using salvaged pipe and settling barrel. No speeches followed, no applause, only the scratch of a pencil across paper. Gideon watched the words appear before turning toward Willa. "Nell Harrow lost most of her garden this year," he said. "Do you think a smaller line would work for her place next spring?" Willa nodded. Yes, that single answer carried farther than months of argument ever had. Months earlier, Brackett had dismissed the system as little more than a contraption built from scrap. Now the same idea had earned a place in the town's permanent record. The proof had never been the pipes. The proof had always been the harvest. The following spring, something unusual happened in Bitterroot Bend. Rusting pipe no longer sat forgotten behind barns or beside abandoned sheds. Farmers who had once thrown it aside now stacked it carefully, wondering where another useful length might fit. A short root watering line appeared in Nell Harrow's kitchen garden. Another found its way beside the small church garden, where vegetables were grown for families who had little to spare. Gideon Rusk never abandoned open ditches entirely, but in the hottest corners of his fields, he quietly buried short branch lines where the wind stole water before crops could use it. Orrin Pike began forging stronger clamps for anyone who asked. Even Elias Brackett stopped referring to the system as a young woman's experiment. In the settlement records, it remained exactly what the evidence had proven it to be, a working gravity-head root watering line. Silas still walked with a cane. His injured leg never truly healed, yet he lingered longer at the edge of the fields than he had in years. The burden that had weighed most heavily on him had never been pain. It had been the fear that the land would disappear with him. Watching another growing season begin eased a part of that burden no medicine ever could. Across the pasture, inside her quiet cabin, Mara continued adding careful notes to the old water notebook whenever another lesson revealed itself. Back at the farmhouse, beside the lantern, rested the seed ledger that Willa's mother had once filled with planting dates and careful observations. One evening, after the first spring rain, Willa opened the worn book again. She did not write about praise. She did not write about proving anyone wrong. She recorded the slope of the line, the depth of the trench, the repaired settling barrel, and the day water reached the eastern field for the first time. Beneath the quiet fields, the old pipes carried water without applause. Hidden beneath straw and soil, they did exactly what they had been built to do. The town had once looked at those discarded pipes and seen nothing but rust. Willa had looked at them and seen one simple truth. Some things are only finished when people stop seeing what they are still capable of becoming.